But he said, I want to be clear with you, Dawn, that at the end of my life, I don't want this. I don't want this time, energy, and money spent on me. I would much rather that go toward my grandchildren's education. And while that stuck with me deeply, I can tell you as a 6-year-old hearing it, what frightened me was not imagining his death and not being with me. It was that it meant I was going to have already become a mother and had children in order for him to have grandchildren. So that was much scarier.
No pressure.
It was horribly daunting.
In this episode, we talk to the lovely Dawn Gross. Dawn is a physician, scientist, and producer. She holds a combined MD and PhD from Tufts University School of Medicine and the Sackler School of Biomedical Sciences. Dawn asserts that public policy must acknowledge and question current incentives that prolong life with no appreciation for the impact on how we die. If you would like to support the show or know more about us, sign up for our newsletter at deathhangout.com or click on the button on screen. Now get ready for this episode, The Game of Death.
It's funny, I never really consider myself working with death. I've not yet met death. I work with people who are very much alive, and they are approaching death.
Right.
My reason for being drawn to working with people at this phase of life is very personal in my own experience with my father's end of life. And when he became terminally ill, I was in the last few months of my specialty training in hematology and bone marrow transplant, and had been really focused on helping to have people who are facing a life-threatening illness of a blood cancer like leukemia consider a therapy that could be as life-threatening in some cases with a bone marrow transplant. And yet, what was the alternative? And I think through my experience of caring for people at that time in their lives, I started to see that maybe there are alternatives. And even though palliative care didn't exist formally as a specialty in the United States at that time, I started to question some of the things that we were doing or the ways we were doing it for people who were, despite our best efforts, clearly approaching death, and we weren't acknowledging it. And this overlap with my father's own terminal illness and how he was approaching it with eyes wide open, seemingly, in contrast. And that he was leading his physicians and he was leading his family. And he himself requested hospice, notably only 4 days before he died, which is not uncommon in the United States, unfortunately. But that he was the one asking. No one in his healthcare team was offering. No one was raising the topic. And I didn't have the insight or knowledge to do it. I hadn't been trained. It was not on my radar. His eyes wide open, as you were saying earlier, of acknowledging that death is part of life started at a very young age for me. He taught me when I was probably 6 or 7, walking through a hospital where he was the administrator. He was at the business end of things. And he took me to see some of the things he was most proud of. And one of them was a program where he required the nurses to rotate through the labor and delivery wards periodically so that they could see, he was very clear with me, the full cycle of life. You need to see it all. And at the time he was showing me, sort of pointing to the door to the ICU, obviously he didn't take me in, but he said, I want to be clear with you, Dawn, that at the end of my life, I don't want this. I don't want this time, energy, and money spent on me. I would much rather that go toward my grandchildren's education. And while that stuck with me deeply, I can tell you as a 6-year-old hearing it, what frightened me was not imagining his death and not being with me. It was that it meant I was going to have to have already become a mother and had children in order for him to have grandchildren. So that was much scarier.
No pressure.
It was horribly daunting. But given that he planted that seed at that young an age, and he was so clear about it, that as his own death was approaching, I was not conflicted about his clarity in it, and that he was not going to try and alter the natural progression of his illness. That was never his intent. And so even though I couldn't see the clarity of the path ahead, literally, meaning hospice, I could see that he was approaching the end of his life, and he was okay with that, as okay as anyone can be, shall we say.
I'm intrigued. You said there was a bit about the fact that the people of the team around him, they didn't, although he was eyes wide open, and you said they weren't acknowledging it. What did that look like?
Oh, there are many instances, hours spent in various specialist offices, and getting and being prescribed these possible treatments to treat the disease, but no one was looking at the whole person. And there was a very telling moment, I think, right hours before my father was to receive his first and only round of chemotherapy, where his medical team was trying to describe what it would be like, because no one had bothered, and he was, of course, anxious as anyone would be with any new thing. Doesn't matter if it's healthcare or a roller coaster. I mean, like, you want to know. Yeah. And so one of his team members just sat down and said very cavalierly, you'll be a little tired after this. Instead of, say, playing 12 or 18 holes of golf, maybe you only get to play 12. My father never played golf. That was an irrelevant metaphor. And more importantly, he was sitting in a wheelchair as white as a ghost. That was also not typical for my father. And I felt like, is anyone seeing who I'm seeing? And I understand that the intention is to make the disease that's having him feel this way go away. But there's more than just that, because the disease is not separate from the human being experiencing it. And so that, again, was one of these pivotal moments for me as a physician, but also as a daughter, to just try and look and see a whole person experiencing something in their whole life, the effect it was having on me, on his wife, on his son. We were all being affected by this, but none of us were being addressed. And first and foremost, my father as a whole person was not being addressed and acknowledged for what he was going through.
When you talked about your father, you said that you have learned things, there's things that you've learned. So what have you learned, going through this experience yourself?
One of the greatest teachings my father shared with me in the last few months of his life is a really intimate conversation that we shared, distinguishing what he wanted and what he needed. And this is something that I have carried forward then for myself, my family, and my patients and their families, and that there's an absolute difference. And it matters that we take the time to distinguish what we want and what we need. Many of us, if we're facing a life-threatening illness, want that disease to go away. And unfortunately, where healthcare science is, that's not always going to be the case right now. And so while we may want that, it's not going to happen. So in the face of that, what do we need? And I started to ask patients a question that invokes magic, if you will. And this happened the first time I was seeing someone in clinic. She was coming to us for a second opinion, again with a blood cancer. And our visit, she would make no eye contact with me. She would answer all my questions in one-word syllables. And I was really stuck. I didn't know how I could possibly make a difference for her. And And out of exasperation, truly, I invoked this question I'd never heard before. I don't know where it came from, but it just came. And I asked her, I said, if I had a magic wand, and I'm not saying that I do, but if I did, what would you wish for? And in a moment, she looked me in the eye, which was the first time our entire visit, and she answered me immediately, no thought required. And she said, make my anxiety go away. Mm. And that was not what I would have expected. Mm. Mm. I immediately would have expected, as the words escaped my mouth before I even knew what I was saying, that she'd say, make my disease go away, make me live forever, or some version therein. No, she said, make my anxiety go away. And that is the same as asking the difference between what you want and what you need. And what she needed was for her anxiety to go away. And that is absolutely something that I or anyone else in medicine can help support. Mm-hmm. And as I've asked this question now hundreds of times to people facing the end of their life quite openly, eyes open, if you will, who are in a hospice, as well as people who are receiving palliative care in the hospital while they're still receiving disease-focused therapy, that no one has ever answered what I would expect. No one has ever answered to make their illness go away. Mm. But what is consistent is they always look me in the eye immediately and have the answer. They never have to think about it. And it has ranged from going to be with my family, going to sit in my garden, going shopping. It is quite varied, but it is all things that, as human beings, we absolutely can support people in having happen.
To me, it reminds me, this question, actually, it's a coaching question that we use, most of the time as coaches, what if you had a magic wand and what you would do, But I've read what you just described. I've read it in your blog post that you posted in the New York Times.
The New York Times,
yeah. You mentioned that, and I was just like amazed, really amazed that they don't want the illness. I don't know why. I'm not in these shoes, so I don't understand that. I don't understand. What do you think at this moment? But to go back to something so simple. So simple, like I want to be with my friends, or I be with my loved ones, so I want to go shopping. This is something. So what does it tell you about the human? Like the human spirit, really. What it's all about, really, when you discover that. What is your thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, when people ask what I do professionally, and I say I'm a hospice and palliative care physician, and if people know what that is, immediately they're like, oh.
Yeah, I'm
sort of look on their face.
I'm sure that you're very popular.
That must be so depressing, or that must be so hard. Or they'll say, if they've had a personal experience, thank you for doing what you do. But it isn't the response of, wow, that sounds so cool. Or something.
I want to do your job immediately.
Right. But for everybody that I get to work with on my team, the people in our profession, when we come together at our national meetings and stuff, there is such joy and a knowing that we love what we get to do. Because what we are invited into every single time we meet with patients and families is this conversation about what matters most. And it seems like, for peculiar reasons as human beings, we require this face-to-face conversation with imagining death for real in order for us to have the clarity of what really matters. And then once we're there, like, all the small stuff melts away, and what really matters is there. Again, as I said, people don't have to think about it. It comes right out instantaneously. And it isn't, there's the cliches of what do you think you'd say on your deathbed, or what has anyone said on their deathbed? Yeah. And it's not like, I wish I spent more time in the office or made more money or things like this, right? What people talk about are these things that we can nod and say, yes, that makes so much sense. Of course they say this. And yet to witness it time and time again and watch families follow their loved ones lead as they're already there, making that clear transition to this is all that matters. And so families often are the last ones to stop that more aggressive, we must change course. We must do something. And the people that are living it are like, we're doing it. Like, I'm here, I'm breathing now. Let's live this. And that sense of impermanence is no longer this thing to be fighting against or wrestling with. It's rather, I'm seizing the day, to invoke another cliche, but it's so true. And I just watch it. And as families come toward that, that's the real magic. And I think for those of us practicing in hospice and palliative medicine, then the phrase I use, I get to be a fairy godmother. Like, I get to make these wishes happen. So when someone says, I want to go shopping, I'm like, let's do it. Where, when, how, like, I'm on it. And when someone says, I love more than anything to fish, well, I might not be able to get them to Canada or to their favorite fishing place in Texas or what have you. There have been many a times where I've brought in the toddler version of a fishing pole and fish. Mm-hmm. And while some of my colleagues who are in training kind of look at me incredulously going, Dawn, really? I don't think. And I'm like, watch. And you see these families just get it immediately and immerse themselves and take on this, now we're fishing. And that's all that matters. Mm-hmm. And it's just glorious. I can't imagine spending my time doing something else professionally, honestly.
You know, it's beautiful the way that you said that, you know, and really what strikes me the most is, you know, I can imagine the doctors, you know, coming to you, we need to do something, we need to fix it, we need to solve it, we need to do something about it. And the way that you said we're already doing it, you know, it's just like, that's amazing, you know. And it shows a parallel to me to the culture that we are today, which is about, we need to do something about it, we need to fix it, we need to struggle, we need to fight about it. There's like this sense of this. I guess my question is, how do you apply this to your daily life? You know, because I'm sure, you know, you have this like constantly. So, and you see a different way that people are reacting when they are on their deathbed and things. So how do you apply this yourself in your life?
Oh, I try not to be a hypocrite, but I certainly am. I mean, there are absolutely times I am up till 2, 3 in the morning working on the computer to enter medical records in the chart and things that are necessary in the work that I do. They're not my most joyful expression of playing. And at the same time, I'll have family. I have 3 children, one who, the youngest is 9, who is constantly just wanting to literally play. And there's the struggle right there. I have to do this. You know, and again, if I were on my deathbed, this is a no contest. Like, this is a non-starter. Of course, I'm playing with you. And yet, the world turns in a certain way that it's a balance. And so, how do I make sure that everything that I'm doing, as much as possible, is consistent with looking through the eyes of, is this absolutely necessary? Is this something that forwards either someone else's life and what matters most to them, which in itself then forwards what matters most to me? Or am I getting caught up in some other person's dance of telling me what matters? You know, taxes, right? I'm going to have to pay them. I'm going to have to spend hours preparing them in the coming weeks. It just is, because it affords me then the opportunity to stay a free citizen so far in this country and do the things I want to do. So I think I'm always trying my best to frame these things in the context of there's a purpose to this, as opposed to I should.
I think, as you said, just the reframing of it. That's where we create our own meaning. That I think so many people are looking for, because there's always going to be things that there are always going to be things like we have to do, like doing our taxes and doing the washing, and you know, those things like that we're going to have to do. But it's how does it fit in? Like, as you said, staying up till 2 a.m. and putting in those medical records. That's part of what allows you to do all the other wonderful stuff that you do. It's right. You can't take the one bit without the other. But in terms of the meaning behind it, then there's a sense of purpose, a sense of why you're doing it.
That it all fits together and they aren't separate. And I think for me, I feel very fortunate that everything in my life one way or another is integrated as opposed to pieced out or siloed. My kids are over here. No, my kids have come to work with me. My kids have been hospice volunteers. My kids know exactly the conversations that I'm having every day. We have them together. So it's integral as opposed to isolated.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. It's not that it's I've got this bit and that bit, the family, job, everything, because that fragmentation is where we lose that sense of meaning and the why we're doing anything at all.
Yeah.
There's something about you just mentioned your kids, and I've read something else, actually looking at your website, you mentioned about deaf education for the kids.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh. So the title was like from sex education to deaf education, something like that. And I say, wow, you taking this a step forward or a step like that. I don't know. Can you tell us more about that, actually?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So this is a new project. My colleague, Dr. Jessica Nudek-Zitter, and I created together. And the inspiration to formalize it came out of a recent online platform put on by the Open IDEO community to reimagine the end of life. And it was an international call for stories, first of all, to say, what has been your experience with death and dying and end of life? And based on these stories, then what are some ideas, what are some projects that we could come up that could reformat or reshape or do this differently or better? And so then the part of the project or call for projects asks people to literally then invent projects or share projects that they're up to. And Jessica and I had been wanting to do something together. She's an ICU and palliative care physician in the Bay Area. And our lives just keep overlapping. Like we need to work together. We need to do something. And so finally, just before the submission phase was about to close, I called her and I said, Jess, we have to come up with something for this. And she and I had both independently, never having spoken to each other specifically about death, but had been thinking about it. I had been in an online chat conversation when it came up for me earlier, months earlier in the spring, unrelated to Open IDEO. And she'd actually written the op-ed in its first iteration that ultimately got published in the New York Times. So we were both thinking of it so we could quickly generate what we were imagining. We both had experience teaching some version of sex education to high school students. So we knew this culture, if you will, of teenagers being open to talking about taboo subjects and also having our own teenagers who could help guide us very quickly and their friends who could help guide us very quickly as to how would we package this? How could we make teenagers want to come to the table and talk about this? And so through that call for projects, we really were forced to manifest it. And so we taught our first pilot class in the end of February of this year. And we're just awed and delighted with the response. The kids, it was a 2-day, we had 2 classrooms of theirs 2 days apart. So 45 minutes one day, 50 minutes the next day. And so it's a very short period of time to try and broach this subject and figure out what is the core takeaway. What could we arm these kids with that will be useful, something they can build on for the rest of their lives. We first had to create context. Why are you talking? These were freshmen in this class, 14-year-olds. Why would you talk with 14-year-olds about this? And we asked them ahead of time what they thought the class was going to be about. And then we asked them once we were in the class, what did they imagine? And it was quite varied. No one had any idea is the bottom line. They thought maybe they were going to learn how to make their funeral arrangements, the finances behind it, go visit a cemetery. One person was like, I really don't know why, honestly, we're taking this, because all that happens is you get old, you have a heart attack and you die. Like, there's nothing to talk about. And so it was great that they were willing to be open about their, incredulousness of why they were taking it, but they still showed up. And then to share with them. So the first day was creating context. of why we're talking about this. And the first activity, we were taught by the teenagers, one, you have to do things that are active. They have to be proactively engaged. It can't be a lecture. And two, it must involve candy. So we did these things, some exercises, some little
Death and candy. Perfect.
that use candy. And so, in fact, the first exercise was passing around a jar, and we'd passed around some multicolored candies. And we had given them a color coding of what each color represented as in respect to a death they may have been exposed to. So a family member had a family member died, or an extended family member, meaning grandparents, aunts and uncles, had they lost a pet, had they lost someone in their community, friends, or within their school. And what about someone in the public eye who they really were connected to and that they felt sad when they died? And, you know, every kid certainly could drop in a candy to at least one of those. And most dropped in many, many more candies. And so as they looked at this jar, they were immediately faced with, wow, there's a lot of death that we've been exposed to.
Yeah.
And so then it was relevant right there. And then we started to share with them, you know, or ask them first, where do they get their understanding of how people die? How do we learn about these things? And we're leading the witness there, but you know, it's media, it's television, it's the movies. And so we showed them a clip of a TV show that most would be very familiar with that portrays the fiction of how medicine reverses death and brings people back to life, and how we're quickly ready to go on a date that same day. And
just like Keith, but that he didn't have his date.
Is it the same? Yeah. And then we contrasted that with a documentary that my colleague Jessica had helped create, following real lives and real deaths in the ICU, and showing what that looks like. And again, these were just a 1.5-minute clips to give them a taste of the contrast and the reality. And that was uncomfortable, and that's where we left them. Is we left them the context of, yeah, you're exposed to this, and here's a little reality check. And when you come back in a couple of days, we're going to show you what to do with that. Some things you can do. How do we talk about it? And so we were nervous leaving them in that space of, holy crap, like this matters, and we don't know how to talk about it. But they all came back, which was reassuring. And we didn't get any angry calls from family members. In fact, they were all happy we are doing this. And so the second day was spent teaching them how to talk about this. And we used one of my favorite games called Go Wish, which is created by a nonprofit in the Bay Area called the Coda Alliance. It's a simple deck of cards. Each of the kids got a deck that they get to keep and hopefully use for the rest of their lives with their friends and family, in having them start learning how to focus on what matters most. What are the things they need? What are the things they want to avoid? And how do we find the words and the language to share this? Now that they understood it was important to do, they now were hungry to do. And to watch these 14-year-olds come away saying, thank you. That was really fun. I had no idea how important this is. I'm so glad. It was
cool.
just so gratifying. So hopefully much more to come. That, like I said, it's the very nascent.
But you know, I'm listening to you, and I cannot help but think that us adults, we need that. You know, actually, not kids. You know, adults are actually the ones that really need something like that. You know, just to awaken a little bit. No, what do you think?
So, I totally agree, and I love teaching people to play this game. I use it in the hospital, and I teach it to people in the community. I play it with people on the airplane. So if you ever fly and you're sitting next to me, you can predict we'll be playing it with.
Let's play a game.
Let's play
a death game.
and you know, I really believe children will lead us. They are so curious. And they don't yet have the taboo built in. If anything, if the taboo exists, they want to go toward it as opposed to away. Whereas as adults, we repel. So it's not that we shouldn't. It's just a harder sell, if you will. It's harder to engage. Once you engage, again, I I teach adults to play Go Wish all the time, and you can't get them to stop once they're there. But getting them to the table is much more challenging than young people. The youngest person I played with is my youngest son. He was 8 at the time. And he was desperate to play because he'd watched me play with my husband. I play every year with my husband on our anniversary. He watched me play with his older siblings. We played on the radio, in fact. And he was just like furious. Why didn't I get to come? Why can't I know how to talk about this? I want to talk about this. Like, and so finally we played it. And yeah, they can talk about this. They're not built to be afraid of this. None of us are actually built to avoid this. It is in our DNA. Mm-hmm. It's who we are. And we do stuff that then teaches us to get in the way of it or to shun it.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Again, please support the show by signing up at deathhangout.com or clicking on the subscribe button on your screen.